4. Nature is the shape in which the man of higher cultures synthesizes and interprets the immediate impressions of his senses. History is that from which his imagination seeks comprehension of the living existence of the world in relation to his own life, which he thereby invests with a deeper reality. Whether he is capable of creating these shapes, which of them it is that dominates his waking consciousness, is a primordial problem of all human existence. Man, thus, has before him two possibilities of world formation. But it must be noted at the very outset that these possibilities are not necessarily actualities, and if we are to inquire into the sense of all history, we must begin by solving a question which has never yet been put, viz., for whom is there history? The question is seemingly paradoxical, for history is obviously for everyone to this extent, that every man with his whole existence and consciousness is a part of history. But it makes a great difference whether anyone lives under the constant impression that his life is an element in a far wider life course that goes on for hundreds and thousands of years, or conceives of himself as something rounded off and self-contained. For the latter type of consciousness, there is certainly no world history, no world as history. But how if the self-consciousness of a whole nation, how if a whole culture rests on this ahistoric spirit? How must actuality appear to it? The world, life. Consider the classical culture. In the world consciousness of the Hellenes, all experience, not merely the personal but the common past, was immediately transmuted into a timeless, immobile, mythically fashioned background for the particular momentary present. Thus, the history of Alexander the Great began even before his death to be merged by classical sentiment in the Dionysus legend, and to Caesar there seemed at the least nothing preposterous in claiming descent from Venus. Such a spiritual condition is practically impossible for us men of the West, with a sense of time distances so strong that we habitually and unquestioningly speak of so many years before or after Christ to reproduce in ourselves. But we are not on that account entitled, in dealing with the problems of history, simply to ignore the fact. What diaries and autobiographies yield in respect of an individual, that historical research, in the widest and most inclusive sense, that is, every kind of psychological comparison and analysis of alien peoples, times and customs, yields as to the soul of a culture as a whole. But the classical culture possessed no memory, no organ of history in this special sense. The memory of the classical man, so to call it, though it is somewhat arbitrary to apply to alien souls a notion derived from our own, is something different, since past and future, as arraying perspectives in the working consciousness, are absent, and the pure present, which so often roused Goethe's admiration in every product of the classical life, and in sculpture particularly, fills that life with an intensity that to us is perfectly unknown. This pure present, whose greatest symbol is the Doric column, in itself predicates the negation of time, of direction. For Herodotus and Sophocles, as for Themistocles or a Roman consul, the past is subtilized instantly into an impression that is timeless and changeless, polar and not periodic in structure. In the last analysis, of such stuff as myths are made of, whereas for our world sense and our inner eye, the past is a definitely periodic and purposeful organism of centuries or millennia. But it is just this background which gives the life, whether it be the classical or the Western life, its special colouring. What the Greek called cosmos was the image of a world that is not continuous, but complete. Inevitably, then, the Greek man himself was not a series, but a term. For this reason, although classical man was well acquainted with the strict chronology and almanac reckoning of the Babylonians, and especially the Egyptians, and therefore with that eternity sense and disregard of the present as such, which revealed itself in their broadly conceived operations of astronomy and their exact measurements of big-time intervals, none of this ever became intimately a part of him. What his philosophers occasionally told him on the subject they had heard, not experienced, and what a few brilliant minds in the Asiatic Greek cities, such as Hipparchus and Aristarchus, discovered, was rejected alike by the Stoic and by the Aristotelian, and outside a small professional circle not even noticed. Neither Plato nor Aristotle had an observatory. In the last years of Pericles, the Athenian people passed a decree by which all who propagated astronomical theories were made liable to impeachment. This last was an act of the deepest symbolic significance, expressive of the determination of the classical soul to banish distance in every aspect from its world consciousness. As regards classical history writing, take Thucydides. The mastery of this man lies in his truly classical power of making alive and self-explanatory the events of the present, and also in his possession of the magnificently practical outlook of the born statesman, who has himself been both general and administrator. In virtue of this quality of experience, which we unfortunately confuse with the historical sense proper, his work confronts the merely learned and professional historian as an inimitable model, and quite rightly so. But what is absolutely hidden from Thucydides is perspective, the power of surveying the history of centuries, that which for us is implicit in the very conception of a historian. The fine pieces of classical history writing are invariably those which set forth matters within the political present of the writer, whereas for us it is the direct opposite, our historical masterpieces without exception being those which deal with the distant past. Thucydides would have broken down in handling even the Persian wars, let alone the general history of Greece, while that of Egypt would have been utterly out of his reach. He, as well as Polybius and Tacitus, who like him were practical politicians, loses his sureness of eye from the moment when, in looking backwards, he encounters motive forces in any form that is unknown in his practical experience. For Polybius, even the First Punic War, for Tacitus, even the reign of Augustus, are inexplicable. As for Thucydides, his lack of historical feeling, in our sense of the phrase, is conclusively demonstrated on the very first page of his book by the astounding statement that before his time, about 400 BC, no events of importance had occurred in the world. Extended footnote. The attempts of the Greeks to frame something like a calendar or a chronology after the Egyptian fashion, besides being very belated indeed, were of extreme naivety. The Olympiad reckoning is not an era in the sense of, say, the Christian chronology, and is moreover a late and purely literary expedient without popular currency. The people, in fact, had no general need of a numeration wherewith to date the experiences of their grandfathers and great-grandfathers, though a few learned persons might be interested in the calendar question. We are not here concerned with the soundness or unsoundness of a calendar, but with its currency, with the question of whether men regulated their lives by it or not. But incidentally, even the list of Olympian victors before 500 is quite as much of an invention as the lists of earlier Athenian archons or Roman consuls. Of the colonizations we possess not one single authentic date. Edward Mayer. In Greece before the 5th century, no one ever thought of noting or reporting historical events. Belloc. We possess an inscription which sets forth a treaty between Elis and Heraea, which was to be valid for 100 years from this year. What this year was is, however, not indicated. After a few years, no one would have known how long the treaty had still to run. Evidently, this was a point that no one had taken into account at the time. Indeed, the very men of the moment who drew up the document probably themselves soon forgot. Such was the childlike fairy story character of the classical presentation of history that any ordered dating of the events of, say, the Trojan War, which occupies in their series the same position as the Crusades in ours, would have been felt as a sheer solecism. Equally backward was the geographical science of the classical world as compared with that of the Egyptians and the Babylonians. E. Meyer shows how the Greeks' knowledge of the form of Africa degenerated from Herodotus, who followed Persian authorities, to Aristotle. The same is true of the Romans as the heirs of the Carthaginians. They first repeated the information of their alien forerunners, and then slowly forgot it. End of extended footnote. Consequently, classical history down to the Persian Wars, and for that matter the structure built up on traditions at much later periods, are the product of an essentially mythological thinking. The constitutional history of Sparta is a poem of the Hellenistic period, and Lycurgus, on whom it centres, and whose biography we are given in full detail, was probably in the beginning an unimportant local god of Mount Taygetus. The invention of pre-Hannibalian Roman history was still going on even in Caesar's time. The story of the expulsion of the Tarquins by Brutus is built round some contemporary of the censor Appius Claudius, 310 BC. The names of the Roman kings were at that period made up from the names of certain plebeian families which had become wealthy. In the sphere of constitutional history, setting aside altogether the constitution of Servius Tullius, we find that even the famous land law of Licinius, 367 BC, was not in existence at the time of the Second Punic War. When Epaminondas gave freedom and statehood to the Messenians and the Arcadians, these peoples promptly provided themselves with an early history. But the astounding thing is not that history of this sort was produced, but that there was practically none of any other sort. And the opposition between the classical and the modern outlook is sufficiently illustrated by saying that Roman history before 250 BC, as known in Caesar's time, was substantially a forgery, and that the little that we know has been established by ourselves, and was entirely unknown to the later Romans. In what sense the classical world understood the word history we can see from the fact that the Alexandrian Romance literature exercised the strongest influence upon serious political and religious history, even as regards its matter. It never entered the classical head to draw any distinction of principle between history as a story and history as documents. When, towards the end of the Roman Republic, Varro set out to stabilize the religion that was fast vanishing from the people's consciousness, he classified the deities whose cult was exactly and minutely observed by the state into certain and uncertain gods, i.e., into gods of whom something was still known, and gods that, in spite of the unbroken continuity of official worship, had survived in name only. In actual fact, the religion of Roman society in Varro's time, the poet's religion which Goethe and even Nietzsche reproduced in all innocence, was mainly a product of Hellenistic literature, and had almost no relation to the ancient practices which no one any longer understood. Mommsen clearly defined the West European attitude towards this history when he said that the Roman historians, meaning especially Tacitus, were men who said what it would have been meritorious to omit, and omitted what it was essential to say. In the Indian culture we have the perfectly ahistoric soul. Its decisive expression is the Brahman nirvana. There is no pure Indian astronomy, no calendar, and therefore no history, so far as history is the track of a conscious spiritual evolution. Of the visible course of their culture, which, as regards its organic phase, came to an end with the rise of Buddhism, we know even less than we do of classical history, rich though it must have been in great events between the 12th and 8th centuries. And this is not surprising, since it was in dream shapes and mythological figures that both came to be fixed. It is a full millennium after Buddha, about 500 AD, when Ceylon first produces something remotely resembling historical work, the Mahavansa. The world consciousness of Indian man was so ahistorically built that it could not even treat the appearance of a book written by a single author as an event determinate in time. Instead of an organic series of writings by specific persons, there came into being, gradually, a vague mass of texts into which everyone inserted what he pleased, and notions such as those of intellectual individualism, intellectual evolution, intellectual epochs, played no part in the matter. It is in this anonymous form that we possess the Indian philosophy, which is at the same time all the Indian history that we have, and it is instructive to compare with it the philosophy history of the West, which is a perfectly definite structure made up of individual books and personalities. Indian man forgot everything, but Egyptian man forgot nothing. Hence, while the art of portraiture, which is biography in the kernel, was unknown in India, in Egypt it was practically the artist's only theme. The Egyptian soul, conspicuously historical in its texture and impelled with primitive passion towards the infinite, perceived past and future as its whole world, and the present, which is identical with waking consciousness, appeared to him simply as the narrow common frontier of two immeasurable stretches. The Egyptian culture is an embodiment of care, which is the spiritual counterpoise of distance, care for the future, expressed in the choice of granite or basalt as the craftsman's materials, in the chiselled archives, in the elaborate administrative system, in the net of irrigation works, and necessarily bound up therewith, care for the past. The Egyptian mummy is a symbol of the first importance. The body of the dead man was made everlasting, just as his personality, his ka, was immortalized through the portrait statuettes, which were often made in many copies, and to which it was conceived to be attached by a transcendental likeness. Footnotes. 1. Contrast with this the fact, symbolically of the highest importance and unparalleled in art history, that the Hellenes, though they had before their eyes the works of the Mycenaean age, and their land was only too rich in stone, deliberately reverted to wood. Hence the absence of architectural remains of the period 1200 to 600. The Egyptian plant column was from the outset of stone, whereas the Doric column was wooden, a clear indication of the intense antipathy of the classical soul towards duration. Footnote 2. Is there any Hellenic city that ever carried out one single comprehensive work that tells of care for future generations? The road and water systems which research has assigned to the Mycenaean, i.e. the pre-classical, age, fell into disrepair and oblivion from the birth of the classical peoples, that is, from the Homeric period. It is a remarkably curious fact, proved beyond doubt by the lack of epigraphic remains, that the classical alphabet did not come into use till after 900, and even then only to a limited extent, and for the most pressing economic needs. Whereas in the Egyptian, the Babylonian, the Mexican, and the Chinese cultures, the formation of a script begins in the very twilight of dawn. Whereas the Germans made themselves a runic alphabet, and presently developed that respect for writing as such, which led to the successive refinements of ornamental calligraphy, the classical primitives were entirely ignorant of the numerous alphabets that were current in the south and the east. We possess numerous inscriptions of Hittite Asia Minor and of Crete, but not one of Homeric Greece. End of footnotes. There is a deep relation between the attitude that is taken towards the historic past and the conception that is formed of death, and this relation is expressed in the disposal of the dead. The Egyptian denied mortality. The classical man affirmed it in the whole symbolism of his culture. The Egyptians embalmed even their history in chronological dates and figures. From pre-Solonian Greece, nothing has been handed down, not a year date, not a true name, not a tangible event, with the consequence that the later history, which alone we know, assumes undue importance. But for Egypt we possess, from the 3rd millennium and even earlier, the names and even the exact reign dates of many of the kings, and the new empire must have had a complete knowledge of them. Today, pathetic symbols of the will to endure, the bodies of the great pharaohs lie in our museums, their faces still recognizable. On the shining, polished granite peak of the pyramid of Amenemhet III, we can read today the words, "Amenemhet looks upon the beauty of the sun," and on the other side, "Higher is the soul of Amenemhet than the height of Orion, and it is united with the underworld." Here indeed is victory over mortality and the mere present. It is to the last degree unclassical.